Thank you and good afternoon. So today's session is about pediatric use information in labeling. And specifically, here's my disclaimer. It's a similar disclaimer as before, and the examples I'm providing in this session may not include all the recommended and required information in labeling for presentation purposes. So this presentation is a discussion of the final guidance named Pediatric Information Incorporated into Human Prescription Drug and Biological Products. The guidance was finalized in March of this year, 2019. During this presentation, I will refer to it as the Pediatric Labeling Guidance. So the bulk of the presentation I will discuss four pediatric use situations discussed in the guidance. Additionally, I will discuss when and how to incorporate data from juvenile animal studies into labeling. Also, I'll discuss how stakeholder input influenced the development of this guidance and how we developed pediatric use information and labeling. So before I get to stakeholder input, it's probably good to go over with respect to the status of pediatric use information and labeling. As you recall, about 25 years ago in 1994, we had the Pediatric Labeling Rule. At that time, there was very little information about pediatric patients in labeling. Partly, we didn't have much data, and another reason is sometimes the data that we had was not included in labeling. So it's been over the last 25 years, we've had a lot of pediatric data, primarily because of legislation, BPCA, which has economic incentives for conducting pediatric studies, voluntary pediatric studies. In addition, we've had PREA, which requires certain pediatric studies. So with all that data, the question right now is how do we incorporate it into labeling? We've had recently stakeholders ask us certain questions about pediatric use information and labeling. And specifically, is the product approved in pediatric use for pediatric patients? And if it is approved in pediatric patients, what age groups is it approved in? So here is a fictitious example in the Pediatric Use Subsection, in the use in specific population section, in which it's not totally clear what age groups the product is approved for. Specifically, this fictitious example does not have a pediatric use statement. And what I'm defining pediatric use statement is a statement that, such as the safety and effectiveness of drug X for indication Y has been established in a certain pediatric age group. That is what we're calling a pediatric use statement. The first sentence in this fictitious example is a data sentence. It's a fact that 150 pediatric patients were studied, but it doesn't tell you anything about whether safety and effectiveness was established. So here, it's not clear whether safety and effectiveness was established in pediatric patients age 1 to 17, 2 to 17, 4 to 17, or another pediatric age group. In this next fictitious example, you have, looking first at the Pediatric Use Subsection, it has a pediatric use statement, and it also has a basis of approval statement. Just looking at subsection 8.4, it looks like it's approved this drug is only approved in adolescents. However, if you look at section 1, it seems like it's approved for a slightly broader population, potentially, all pediatric patients. So there's a mismatch, there's an inconsistency with respect to pediatric use in subsections 8.4 and section 1. So one thought when you're developing labeling, specifically look at section 1, section 2, and subsection 8.4, and have some consistent information about pediatric use in all those sections and subsections. So Pediatric Labeling Guidance outlines 4 pediatric use scenarios. Scenario 1 talks about when a product is approved in pediatric patients when safety and effectiveness has been established in all pediatric patients or a subset of pediatric patients. Scenarios 2 to 4 are situations where safety and effectiveness has not been established in pediatric patients, all pediatric patients, or a subset of pediatric patients. And it goes into different scenarios. Scenario 2 is a situation where you have pediatric data. It's available. However, the data is inconclusive or it's negative. And what do I mean by negative? The data strongly suggests that the product may be unsafe or ineffective in that all pediatric patients or that pediatric subgroup. Scenario 3, also again not approved in pediatric patients, that right here we don't have pediatric data available, maybe because a study has never been done, or maybe studies are ongoing. Scenario 4 is a somewhat uncommon scenario where a product is contraindicated in all pediatric patients or a subset of pediatric patients or a specific age group in pediatric patients. So scenario 1, I'm going to go over each of the scenarios. Again, this is a situation where a product is approved for pediatric use. The evidence supports the safety and effectiveness of use in a pediatric population. And I'll go through selected sections and subsections of the full prescribing information that typically has information about pediatric use, starting with section 1. So according to the Pediatric Labeling Guidance, as well as the indications and usage section of labeling guidance, the draft indications and usage section of labeling guidance that Iris talked about earlier this morning, all pediatric age groups, all pediatric indications should be included in the indication statement. And why is that? Well, it basically provides clarity to healthcare providers what age groups the product is approved in. It also allows some consistency throughout the labeling. As I talked about before in one of the examples, there was an inconsistent information between sections 1 and subsection 8.4. By putting the age groups in section 1, you provide that clarity. And here's an example of that clarity. Iris also talked about limitations of use. It's not common that we have limitations of use in pediatric patients or a subset of pediatric patients. But as Iris clearly stated, and the guidance, the draft guidance, indications and uses guidance stated, we don't recommend including limitations of use if the product or drug was not studied in pediatric patients. There's got to be a reasonable concern about the benefit-risk profile in pediatric patients. So just because you haven't studied it, we should not be adding a limitation of use. Dosage administration, we are required to provide, if a product is approved in pediatric patients, to provide pediatric dosage. In general, we recommend specifying the age groups, unless sometimes it may be clear, but in general, we recommend specifying the age groups in the section 2, dosage administration section. Also very important to describe important administration instructions and preparation instructions. For example, if you have a lyophilized powder that needs to be reconstituted, or you have a product that needs to be further diluted, and there are special considerations in pediatric patients that must be included in section 2. Additionally, let's say you have a reconstituted lyophilized powder, and you're trying to store that product, the reconstituted product, you want to specify the storage conditions specific to the pediatric dosage form in section 2. So adverse reactions, that adverse reaction section must include the details of pediatric adverse reactions, specifically if there are any novel adverse reactions that include in the pediatric population, or if there's a difference in frequency or severity in adverse reactions in pediatric patients compared to other approved populations, a la adults. I'm going to skip over the pediatric use subsection here, which goes next. I'll talk about that later in the presentation. So with respect to, again, we're referring to the situation where the product is approved in pediatric patients. The clinical pharmacology section should include details of pharmacokinetic studies, pharmacodynamic or pharmacogenomic studies that were done in pediatric patients. Essentially, the entire labeling is filled up with pediatric use information if the product is approved for pediatric use. Additionally, we'll include data in Section 12, Clinical Pharmacology section, about modeling, simulation, or bridging studies. Going on to the clinical studies section of labeling, this is a common question. A product is approved for pediatric use. We've conducted one pediatric study. Where does that information go? As the earlier Jeannie was talking about distribution of information in Section 6 and Section 14, adverse reactions and clinical studies. Here I'm talking about distribution of information between subsection 8.4, pediatric use subsection, and Section 14, clinical studies. So the recommendations and the guidance as the details should be included in Section 14 about pediatric studies. So this is your design of your study, your endpoints, your information for you to understand the population in terms of important baseline disease characteristics, as well as the study results. Now, subsection 8.4, within the basis of approval, you could summarize information, potentially study designs. But the details of this should be of a pediatric study should be in Section 14. Okay, now we're going to subsection 8.4, again in scenario 1, where a product is approved for pediatric use. So in general, one should include a pediatric use statement. And I described before what a pediatric use statement would be. The safety and effectiveness of a drug has been established in pediatric patients, for example. And there are certain situations where a pediatric use statement is required, must be there. In general, we recommend it be the first sentence of that subsection so healthcare providers can clearly identify the usage in pediatric patients. So, basis of approval. Pediatric use is slightly different than in other situations. This is a good thing where we must, in many situations, specifically when you have extrapolation of efficacy from adults, and potentially you have additional PK and safety data, but the efficacy is extrapolated from adults, you must include you must include the basis of approval. In other situations, our center generally recommends including the basis of approval to have a consistent approach. And this gives a better understanding to the pediatrician, the healthcare practitioner, why the product was approved in pediatric patients. In general, we recommend avoiding terminology such as based on clinical experience. So we don't recommend including the terminology based upon clinical experience as a basis of approval statement, partly because it's not totally clear, and partly because it may not meet our regulatory standard of approving a product in pediatric patients. So here's a fictitious example showing you the location of the pediatric use statement that is in blue. And I'm also showing you an example of the basis of approval statement that is in purple. Notice that the basis of approval statement here, this is basically a product where efficacy was extrapolated from adults. And it's a high-level summary of information. And this, one should include cross-references for more detailed information. So, for example, you want to see about novel adverse reactions, you can go to subsection 6.1 in pediatric patients. You could also summarize that information in the pediatric use subsection, but the details should be in other sections. The clinical pharmacology section should be the detailed PK information, PD, pharmacogenomic information, and as I mentioned earlier, the details of the clinical studies should be in section 14. So this is a subset of scenario 1. This is a scenario where a product is approved in pediatric patients, and it's only approved in pediatric patients. It's not approved in adults. So the entire labeling is about pediatric use. It's not about adult use. It's only about pediatric use. So in this scenario, one would include the Pediatric Use Statement as the first statement. That's the blue. And the purple are the limitations that one must include. This limitation is stating where safety and effectiveness was not established, the age groups. One must cover all age groups in the Pediatric Use subsection, and also must uncover all indications, whether they're adult indications or pediatric indications. It must be discussed in some fashion. Notice that we have the phrase, and the information on this use is discussed throughout the labeling. In this scenario, what the guidance speaks to is, as I stated earlier, the entire labeling is about pediatric use. So it would be very difficult to capture all that information in that subsection 8.4. So we're stating the entire labeling has got pediatric use information. Note we've used this approach in other scenarios. For example, we've used that when in a pregnancy situation where a product is approved for a pregnancy-related condition, where the entire labeling has information about pregnancy. We've used that in subsection 8.1, pregnancy. So in addition to the information I talked about before about pediatric use statements, a pediatric use statement, a basis of approval statement, if this is applicable, one must also include risks or safety concerns in pediatric patients and monitoring information, limitations on the pediatric indication, and that could include potentially what age groups in which the safety and effectiveness has not been established, or potentially if there's a limitation of use in a pediatric limitation of use in the indications and usage section, that should also be included in subsection 8.4. And any differences in responses, potentially differences in adverse reactions, or differences in PK/PD response. So now I'm going to the next three scenarios where a product is not approved in pediatric patients, where the evidence does not support the safety and effective use of a drug for a pediatric population. So scenario 2, as I stated earlier, are the situation where there pediatric studies have been conducted, the data is available, however the data is inconclusive, or the studies are negative, and as defined earlier, negative meaning that there's concerning data about the drug may be not safe or ineffective in pediatric patients. In this scenario, one must also include a pediatric use statement, and it's important, as stated in one of the earlier talks, one must not imply or suggest a usage, an indication, or a dosage that is not approved. So here, the pediatric use statement, one states the safety and effectiveness of drug X have not been established in pediatric patients for indication A. So it's somewhat of a negative pediatric use statement. So that's a pediatric use statement. And then if you do, you can include, actually it's encouraged to include information about negative studies in pediatric patients because our statute states that pediatric use information should be described if it's negative, positive, or inconclusive. So this is one way of describing two negative efficacy studies, however, but not implying that the product can be used in this population. So additionally, with respect to scenario 2, if the product is associated with a specific safety concern, one must describe that concern in the pediatric use subsection, and if applicable, that information also must be included in other sections of labeling, specifically the box warning, warnings and precautions, and or the contraindication section. So even though the product is not approved in pediatric patients, one, in certain situations, must describe it in other sections of labeling with appropriate disclaimers. And as I stated earlier, one would cross-reference from the pediatric use subsections potentially to the box warning, warnings and precautions, and or contraindication sections if applicable. So now we're going on to the scenario 3. Again, it's not approved in a pediatric population. However, the reason here is that studies have not been conducted or studies are ongoing. And in this situation, one must also include a pediatric use statement. And I presented 2 examples of pediatric use statements. Now, one could potentially consider differentiating scenario 2 from scenario 3 by including an additional statement by stating studies have not been conducted. Because you may not be able to distinguish scenario 2 from scenario 3. That is a consideration. So continuing with scenario 3, if there's, so here you may not have pediatric data. However, if you have additional pediatric human data, but potentially if you have animal data, you have biological plausibility about a safety concern in pediatric patients. And actually, as Jeannie presented in our last slide, she presented a situation with juvenile animal data that resulted in a box warning. So in that scenario, there wasn't pediatric use data. It was based upon animal data. So in this case, one must include it, if it's appropriate, in the sections we discussed, box warning, warnings and precautions, and or contraindication statement. And here is an example. Here, the first sentence in black font that's a pediatric use statement, that safety and effectiveness has not been established in pediatric patients aged 6 months and older. However, there's additional information about pediatric patients less than 6 months old. Specifically, it's not recommended for potential safety concern. And the safety concern is discussed more in the warnings and precautions section, so you would cross-reference there. Again, we don't have pediatric data, but we have other data that strongly suggest a safety concern. So moving on now to scenario 4. Scenario 4 is a situation where a drug is contraindicated in either all pediatric patients, a subgroup of pediatric patients, or a pediatric population. And in this situation, instead of a traditional pediatric use statement, one would include in the first sentence that the drug is contraindicated in pediatric patients, and also to include the rationale. As we know, all contraindications must be listed in section 4, contraindication section. So if it's contraindicated in a specific pediatric patients, not only should you list it here, you must also list it in section 4. So pediatric use statements, as discussed throughout the presentation, they're generally required in all situations, and we want to include that for all indications, adults, indications for adults, pediatric patients, and we want to cover all pediatric age groups. So it may be easy if you have, easier if you have a product approved for one indication. We have seen situations where a product is approved for 5 different indications. And some are pediatric indications, some are adults. That it becomes a lot more complicated, subsection 8.4. But you could use some of the principles in this guidance to develop that labeling for that situation. So examples of pediatric use statements, I showed the first 3. I would say the first 2 are really more the traditional pediatric use statements. Example 4, the contraindicated, you could consider that an alternative statement. The pediatric use subsection regulation states that alternative statements may be appropriate. So for contraindications, we would avoid the traditional pediatric use statement and use a contraindicated statement. Now, the last example out here is not a pediatric use statement. It's really more about a data, about what was studied. It's not a usage statement. So moving on to juvenile animal toxicology data. So in general, if we do include juvenile animal toxicology data, it should be included in subsection 8.4, pediatric use. Previously, sometimes this data was in subsection 8.4, sometimes it was in section 13, non-clinical toxicology, sometimes it was elsewhere. So for a consistent approach, if it's included, the recommendations are to include it in subsection 8.4 as the last part of that subsection. So we recommend that the guidance recommends the human data goes first, and then the last thing is the juvenile animal toxicology data. And if we include it, we should include the title juvenile animal toxicology data to have a consistent approach. That's under a heading in the pediatric use subsection. So generally, you want to include data from juvenile animal studies if it's a negative finding. In general, you may not need to include that. However, if you have important information about something that wasn't seen or not studied in pediatric patients, for example, additional information about growth or long-term use that's not studied, that's certainly something that you would want to include if it's negative in subsection 8.4. If you have both animal data and human data, and both you think are important for labeling, the majority of the information should be the clinical data, and you can add a little bit of the juvenile animal toxicology data. If you do include the data, we recommend that you include clinically relevant terminology. So when you're talking about juvenile animals, what is the relevant pediatric age? When you're talking about dosage in juvenile animals, what's the relevant dosage in pediatric patients? If you're talking about durations, what's the relevant duration in humans? So many clinicians may not understand this, how to interpret animal data. And so you're trying to convert it and make it more understandable to the healthcare practitioner, to the pediatrician. Okay, so challenge question number 1. Which statement may be an appropriate pediatric use statement? And I'll let you read that. A, B, C, D, E. Folks want to shout out the answer? Great. D. Right, so the first two are appropriate pediatric use statements as defined in this presentation and also in the guidance. C is not a usage statement. It's interesting, it's factual, it's great, but it doesn't tell you whether safety and effectiveness has been established. Question 2. Include a pediatric use statement for which indications in the pediatric use subsection. Assuming the drug is approved for, it's got 3 indications. Indication A, adults and pediatric patients. Indication B, adults only. Indication C, it's only approved in adolescents. Which situation should you include a pediatric use statement? And here are the choices. Folks want to shout that out? I think I'm hearing E, which is great. All situations you want to include the pediatric use statement. Again, if it's approved only in adults, it would be somewhat of a negative pediatric use statement. If it's approved in pediatric patients, you would include a positive pediatric use statement. So you could see this is an example that could get very complicated. Again, every indication and every age group you want to cover. So summary, the Pediatric Labeling Guidance that was finalized in March contains 4 pediatric use statements and information about how to distribute and incorporate juvenile animal toxicology data. One should include pediatric use statements generally for all adult and pediatric patients and also cover all pediatric age groups. Thank you.